Hi class, I hope you are surviving the beginning of the semester and getting settled into your class. We are headed into week 3 material, reviewing the literature. So we have built a research kind of foundation so far this semester, and we are now going to start digging pretty deep into the research process. And we're going to do that by moving into step 2. So we talked about research problems and all that fun stuff last week, and this week we are going to be evaluating literature. So, we are going to tackle the literature review this week, which is step 2 of the research process. And it is a crucial part of your research writing and project development. Whether you are headed, thesis or you are headed research project, either way, this will be an just crucial component of that. And so we need to understand just the basics. So when we talk about a literature review, it is a written summary of literature. Hopefully you've done something like this in a bachelor's degree at some point in your collegiate experience. And it's really that culmination of taking what's been done in that research topic for you, organizing it into subtopics, pulling all of this literature, whether it's from a library or online resources, and then being able to really go from this broad to specific understanding of the topic you are trying to research. So, if I could break this into 4 key components of a literature review, it would be the ones you're seeing on the screen right now. So, step number 1, I need to connect this to prior research and begin to build a framework for my research problem. I need to build that background and narrow that focus, going from kind of keywords all the way down into research questions or my research objective. Really building that need for the study and synthesizing what I know already exists on this topic by research experts. And then last but not least, I need to understand how I'm connecting this to theoretical and conceptual frameworks so that I have this structure I'm building my study on that's built from others that have gone before me, and I'm not just throwing paint at the wall and hoping that my research project is interesting and maybe it'll produce some results for me. Before we get any deeper into the literature review, we need to run this through the filter of what is my study? Am I going after a quantitative design or a qualitative design? Because quantitative studies are going to really use this literature review as a justification for why they're researching this problem. And it's going to help build theory, right, and support for this topic. And it might even begin to say, hey, here's some purpose and some research questions based off of the studies that have come before me. And also, I can refer back to that huge chunk of literature by the end of the research process using results and discussion and say, hey, I noticed that we did see this in the literature, and I'm also observing this in my own results in the study. If I'm a qualitative design, I'm really using this process to document the importance of the research problem, right? Again, qualitative is that exploration. I'm trying to build you a reason for there's a reason we think this is important and there's a reason we want to go after this. And we're trying to compare and contrast that as we get to the end of the study, basically saying this is worth exploring. We need this, research data, survey data from these people. We need these stories, and the justification part isn't as strong as quantitative, but we are still going to use literature to really build the need for this study. Now, as we move past the filter of qualitative and quantitative, we need to understand that there are 6 key steps of a literature review design. And sometimes we do this in a very linear fashion, and sometimes it's kind of this circular process where I don't know what I'm trying to do. Research writing is hard. Maybe I've never written a literature review of this size. I remember when I tackled my own thesis, by the time I got done, it was like 165 references. It was pages of my life. It was my entire chapter 2 of my thesis project. And it was really hard for me to get started. I didn't quite understand how intensive this process was. So whether we are kind of hopping in one area and then having to go back and go, oh, you know what? I started to write, but I didn't know my key terms, and I'm not sure where to locate stuff, but I started to kind of think through organization. You'll feel a little bit of that tug as you're working through this process when you get to your own writing. We won't do that, scale of writing in this class, but it is going to be the foundation for projects and theses down the road. If we look at this in a linear fashion, we can just say, hey, we are going to move through this process step 1 through step 6. It's always going to look like this. I'm going to use this format to help myself build this really crucial piece of the research process. Let's start with step 1, which is really identifying the key terms that you are going to be pursuing. If we are, trying to develop a project, it might look like developing a title to start with. I always have to write my titles last. I don't know what that is about me, but I can never use those to get my key terms. Some people do not feel that way. And you're going to develop 2 to 3 keywords. So for me, if I was, looking at my quantitative project as a student here at Chico State, my keywords were efficacy, which we'll talk about in a little bit, animal science, pre-veterinarian, and diverse demographics. And those were the things that I was trying to build into my literature review. And so I was often searching for those keywords on my online databases. I used a couple different ones we'll talk about in just a second. You may need something more industry specific. I want to know how students are doing in, FFA, competitions. I want to know how SAEs are working. I want to know classroom, different. Oh gosh, you could take this anywhere, you guys. Our industry is so big. But really, we're using these key terms to help us kind of pose this general research question after we've already started to think through what problem we're trying to go for, and understanding that those keywords are going to be specific to the industry we are researching. So you've got some examples below, if you're trying to do ag business, or you're in the classroom, or you're dealing with soil, some of these should look pretty familiar to you. Then we move into, where do I find these materials? And hopefully this is review for you from some type of, community college, bachelor's degree, whatever that might be. We're going to review it one more time just to make sure we are all clear that step 2 is locating the literature. My 2 preferred ways for you to do this semester are going to be using Google Scholar or our Chico State Library. You tend to have better results if you can go through an educational facility. Usually it's an EDU website. They're going to have extension articles and all sorts of database that you can use. And Google Scholar is great, but often it requires you to pay for stuff. So if you're still in school, go with the library. If you're not, hit up Google Scholar. And just remember that when we are trying to find articles or journals or textbooks or whatever we're looking for, they need to be peer reviewed from industry experts, and hopefully have either been replicated or are showing some really cool study design, and they're from scholarly sources. We want to try to avoid industry materials, but we want to use those sparingly because they are not peer reviewed, and you can kind of say whatever you want on different websites like that. Now, the next thing, as we look at quality research, right, we want to make sure and really understand we are trying to get high standards of quality, effective research, and really understanding where that comes from, right? I want to go after journal articles. I want to go after publications that have been there for a while. We have researchers that have started to explore them. They're more well known, just different components. Like now, step 3. Evaluate and select. Again, we need good and accurate research. We need quality research, right? We were just looking at that diagram beforehand. That slide before was a great diagram of understanding what quality research needs to be. And so I need to understand, as I start to select things, that I'm looking for accredited, I'm looking for known and published journals, I'm looking for peer-reviewed, things that are actually just research studies instead of topical overviews or topical summaries. I want things that are inclusive. I want to see exploration of diverse backgrounds within the research topic. And I want to try to juggle as much of a quantitative, qualitative source balance as possible. Both of those can be very productive within a literature review. And then just making sure that each of these papers has that required component of a research publication for whatever specific study design it might be. And that's going to vary a little bit between quantitative and qualitative, and we're going to get some more practice on that next week and then the following few weeks after that. But again, understanding that we need to have required components for research publication. So as I am digging into literature, I want to kind of really quickly go over a couple things just to have on the back of your brain as you're looking at literature this week. So understanding the difference between a theory, theoretical framework, conceptual framework, and constructs are really important as you start to pull articles to support your research problem. So step one is theories, right? It's something that I assume to be true, or I'm assuming my solution to it, I can test it and determine if it's true based on assumptions or predictions I've seen in the past. That is a little bit different, right, than a theoretical or conceptual framework. We'll go into those in just a second, but those tend to be more of a roadmap. They're supposed to be creating this kind of design and structure for you as you're building a literature review. It should be asking questions like, what are we looking for and where are we going? And can I predict some outcomes? And the reason the theoretical and conceptual framework are important is that if I don't understand kind of the theories I'm trying to pull from the journal articles, I'm going to get really overwhelmed really fast by the amount of information I'm trying to consume. Theoretical framework should be providing structure to really hold up that research theory you're building, right? That assumption we're starting to make. And it's really built from established theories. So think research that's come before, theories that are holding up, and we're trying to use it to explain why my study can exist within this knowledge base, but then also add something new. That's a little bit different than a conceptual framework, which is more of a, organization of key ideas, variables, relationships. It's often going to be things like a picture, diagrams, and it's showing you how things are connecting. And it's usually built from your specific study, kind of explaining the relationships you might be seeing between the variables and concepts in your research project. So the best way to kind of explain a construct is this idea of, okay, I have this construct of student stress. Well, I can't measure student stress. I can measure variables about student stress, things like attendance and grade performance and self-efficacy, emotional health, right? I can get some variables that allow me to measure what I'm seeing about the construct of student stress. So as we move into conceptual and theoretical framework, again, really understanding that it is a framework, it's a roadmap, it's helping me build the design of this study and help you understand why and how things might be connected. So you'll see theoretical and conceptual frameworks separated very clearly here, helping you understand the big difference between them. So again, theoretical, based on previous research, we can measure it. We've got a direction with where we think these variables might go. We can help it, use it to help explain and predict phenomena. Conceptual, again, is something that's more of a mental formation, relationships of just interested variables. We may or may not have a scale. And it's often more related with the researchers feeling about it, right, instead of the actual truth about this theory. And so common frameworks that you've probably seen or heard discussed in educational classrooms are things like efficacy. That was a big one in my thesis project. You've got everything from hierarchy of needs to experiential learning, diffusion of innovations, operant conditioning, expectancy value theory, constructivism, oh my goodness, connectivism. Anyway, all of these frameworks were built, right, with this beautiful process of over and over and over again studying these theories until we had an actual framework where we understand, oh, efficacy is what I believe I know about something, right? And so my research project was, hey, what is the self-efficacy of students coming into the classroom compared to how they actually are performing in a pre-vet program? Because there's a big disconnect for us in our program where students come in thinking they know a lot more than they actually do. And so you can take any of these frameworks, maybe some of these would apply to the research problem you started to develop last week, and use these, right, to help you write your literature review. You could use this and say, hey, I am going after the hierarchy of needs. I live in a, very demographically different region, and I want to understand how the hierarchy of needs applies to my research problem. And you could use that as your framework as you're building that journal, collection is what I usually call it. Now, step 4 is the process of organizing literature. So now I understand, okay, I'm looking for keywords. I know where to find the literature. I understand that I need to have some style of framework in the back of my brain that's going to help me really support this research topic I'm going after. And now I'm getting to the organization process. And students are going to do this a little bit differently. Some students really like to do this in terms of organizing it visually. Some students like to do it kind of categorically or color. Some students prefer paper, some students prefer online. It's really just going to be this process of I'm getting the studies that are relevant to me. I'm taking really good notes and starting to sort them by subtopic and understanding that the structure of papers is going to cover all these different pieces and parts, and I need to really start using them to put them into a category so I can start understanding how to build this holistic background that I need to sell the need of this research problem I'm trying to write about. Now that I've gathered it, I'm starting to get it organized by subtopic. I'm then going to move into step 5, which is really starting to understand how do I synthesize this literature? How do I help myself understand how it connects? So I've got it maybe organized into piles at this point or folders. Again, let's go back to my thesis. I had folders that said, okay, these are animal science articles. Okay, this is efficacy articles. Okay, this is students in California coming into collegiate environments. And I had just these folders. And then as I sat down, I started to create visual literature maps. And for me, I did this on paper. These ones are super fancy online. You can do that too, or just highlighter and whiteboard is super effective. And you start to understand, okay, my major concepts underneath this framework of self-efficacy need to be animal science students, animal science programs, pre-vet programs, efficacy of students, success of students in pre-vet programs, and then understanding which literature that I've collected starts to apply to each of these topics, and then how does it actually interconnect to each other and kind of weed itself all the way back up to that research problem. And then can I break it down into subtopics, really understand the levels of information I have available to myself, and then start to write. Now, again, for those of you that are visual learners, these maps are going to be so helpful. For some of you, it's not. You're just going to sit there and go, I would rather have a Word document with some bullet points and some headings. And that is just as effective, you guys. It honestly sometimes feels like a little bit of a cheat sheet because you can kind of pull really important quotes, throw those in the subtopics, get your in-text citations going, and kind of start building more of the writing. And some students really prefer that style. So just kind of keep that in the back pocket, depending on if you're more of a visual student or if you really like that linear writing process. And as we move from that synthesizing information, we are now ready to write. And there are 2 styles of literature reviews you're going to see, so thematic themes or study by study review. In my thesis, because I was a quantitative study, I really leaned more towards the thematic theme. And you're hearing me talk about that, right? I'm using these topics, these subtopics or subheadings to really explain a theme, and I'm taking it from broad to specific, just like we talked about last week and introduced again today. And I'm going, okay, my big, huge, broad topic is animal science. Then I'm moving into animal science programs. Then I'm moving into pre-vet programs. Then I'm moving into pre-vet animal science kids. And I'm narrowing this using thematic themes all the way through my literature review and just helping the writer follow me, especially if this is something that they're not, as well versed in. Another way you can see this done is study by study review, where you're going to actually take, 5 or 6 studies and say, in this study, this is the finding that came out of it, and you're going to use that as your heading or your subheading on your literature review. But again, you want those studies to help you get more and more specific as you move through, because by the end of this literature review, I should be able to not only conclude those major themes that I'm finding, but also give that very clear need for study, right? Here's my objective, here's my goal, here's why I needed this study to be completed. And then also, as I start to tackle that writing process, remembering that I always have to, especially if I'm using the bullet point form, synthesizing strategy, I have a style manual that I have to be following. It might be a journal specific style manual, it might be a programmatic style manual, or you may be in a collegiate environment and you need to be focusing on APA. And that's going to apply to title pages and page formatting and headings and subheadings and in-text citations and references and all these very specific style rules about how this process needs to be done as you're working through the writing and citing back all of this literature that is not your own. So that formatting and that style manual helps us stay on a professional level away from plagiarism, but it also allows us to identify where some of this really rich literature is coming from that we're using to support our own study. So in our program and in my classroom, you will be using APA, which if you have not used this before is the American Psychological Association. There are some specific journals that we use in our discipline that may be more journal specific, but we almost always start with APA and then format that to the journal specific style when we go to publish in that journal, or go to a research presentation if we're doing posters or seminars, things like that. The next last big thing that I want you to think about as you're working on this writing is that we really need to be paying attention to just the basics. Sentence structure, simple form, avoid informal language, use industry specific terms, make sure you understand that it flows together, that we are tying themes or tying studies together. Grammar is a huge part of our writing process, especially as we're heading into the master's program. And especially if you have decided to tackle a thesis or a research project, you will probably, based off your advisor, get the assistance of an editor, but you need to make sure that you have enough material there that's structured and clear that the editor can even begin to help you with that process. And so there's a fine line there. And then last but not least, just big key things I want you to think about as you start to tackle this, because like I've said, the literature review can be really overwhelming. And unfortunately, it has to happen at the beginning. And it's really going to make you think about why. I always like to call this kind of like the business plan for your research paper, because if I don't know what I'm doing, I don't know how to organize it, I don't know my goals, I don't have any support or backing for why I'm doing what I'm doing, I'm not going to be a very successful researcher. And so whether you are using a visual map to help yourself get organized or a bullet point and subheading, whether you are organizing it in piles on a table or in folders on a computer, my recommendation would be just pick the visual organization strategy that is helpful for you and your brain. Don't go off of what's helpful for somebody else. Go off of you. Second thing I would really recommend is that as you're finding journals, I've got a really cool video posted on this week's material that's showing you how to quickly read through a paper so you're not spending a bunch of time on an article that you probably don't need. Make sure to read those articles quick. If you don't need them, ditch them. And then if you are going to keep them and you're going to use them in that visual map or that bullet point format down the road, just build a reference and an in-text citation on a Word document as soon as you're done reading it and slap it into that folder or on the pile on the table. You will save yourself so much time if you just do it as you go. Trying to wait until the last minute or at the very end is really hard. I also recommend that for just key quotations as you're reading through an article, especially maybe their introduction or their literature review. Pulling key information and then slapping an in-text citation on it, throwing it on a Word document and coming back to it later can also save you a lot of time as you begin this writing process. Well, y'all, that is all I have for you this week. If you've got questions or comments or concerns, please feel free to reach out to me. I know sometimes literature review stuff can feel just a little heavy and a little boring. And this week you're going to be tackling some APA formatting stuff as well. Please make sure that you check out that cheat sheet I built for you. I use it all across Chico State for my undergraduate students. And I actually had one of my master's students who's working over in Wyoming right now, who is an alumni of Chico State and was one of my teacher's assistants, call me the other day and say, hey, I just want you to know I'm still using that APA cheat sheet. So that was hysterical and I got a good laugh out of that. But anyway, just make sure and refer back to that, especially as you're working through that assignment this week. And again, hope you have a wonderful, wonderful week. Talk to you soon.